So tonight's webinar is going to consist of these parts. First of all, we're going to do a short review of systems theory because I'm not sure that everyone knows much about systems theory. And it's interesting, and it will give you a framework and a context for understanding how congregations work, as well as what happens when congregations get anxious. We're also going to be speaking about anxiety in systems and what happens when congregations get anxious. We will talk about what kinds of triggers there are for anxiety in congregations. What is it that causes people in congregations to get anxious? And then last, the differences that leaders can make in an anxious system, because we know that the way that people behave really does have an influence on others. And we know that leaders can make a difference in an anxious system. So I really had to chuckle this afternoon. I guess I wasn't really chuckling. I was kind of despairing. But anyway, the phone call came in at 3 o'clock this afternoon. I mean, literally this afternoon, 3.5 hours before I was ready to do this workshop. In order to disguise the situation, I'm going to have you fill in the blanks as I tell the story. Hello, Nancy. This is Janice, Jerry, Janine, of the UU congregation in East Podunk or East Cupcake or whatever. I wanted to give you an update on the situation I told you about last April. As you remember, I'm the church music director, chair of the Building and Grounds Committee, or member of the Committee on Ministry. Today I've told people I'm quitting. I can't take it anymore. The congregation is losing members, and our fourth largest pledger has left the church. It's all because of the contract minister, the board chair, the chair of our committee. She's changing things and people are upset. I've given my heart and soul to this congregation over the past 3, 5, 10, 15, fill in the blank years, but I've had it. I'm leaving, and so is my friend, my husband, my fiancé. I can't take this trouble anymore. It's just not worth it. So that was a call I had this afternoon, and unfortunately, those kinds of calls come in fairly regularly. Why does this kind of thing happen? Tonight's webinar, I hope, will shed some light on the situation. So first, a short review of systems theory, a framework for looking at how people operate in community. Its first definition is that a system is the configuration of parts connected and joined together by a web of relationships. So before we talk about people, imagine a car's engine or the human body. All parts need to be working well in order to make the engine run or the body healthy. If one breaks down, depending on which part it is, of course, the engine can start to have trouble or immediately have trouble. Emotional systems are a group of people connected and joined together by a web of relationships. People come together, they interact, they mutually influence each other's behaviors, and a change in one person or a change that affects one person will affect the others. So that's how a system works. Systems theory also says that all phenomena can be viewed as a web of relationships among elements. So imagine your congregation as a web of relationships among people. And systems theory says that all systems have common patterns, behaviors, and properties that we can understand and we can use to develop greater insight into the behavior. So that's what we're working on tonight. Systems theory came from, at least the part that we're going to be talking about, emotional systems theory, was initially developed by a man named Murray Bowen. He was a therapist, and he was working with individual patients, and then he got the idea that maybe he should work with family to try to influence the whole system. Because he said, if you influence the change in one person, it is going to influence change in other people. So to work with the family as a whole gives us a better chance of making a real difference. his student, Rabbi Edward Friedman, who lived and worked in the Washington, D.C. area, took this family systems theory and expanded it to congregations and wrote a really thick book on how congregations can work as emotional systems. Peter Steinke, a Lutheran pastor, and others have taken that work and popularized it. So talking about how congregational systems work, talking about anxiety in congregations, and talking about the leader's role in working with anxious congregations, and so on. Peter Steinke has written several good books. One of the last one, I think, is called Congregational Leadership in Anxious Times, Being Calm and Courageous No Matter What. And I'll put that link or the title up at the end of the webinar. I really encourage congregations to take a look at that book. Some congregations have bought copies for the board and have the board read it as a group, a chapter a month perhaps or something like that, then pass it along to committee chairs and so on, so that the whole leadership of the congregation gets to understand this stuff, and then it's easier to identify what's going on to try to make some change if there's a problem. So in terms of systems thinking, when you're using systems thinking, there are some principles. First of all, you try to look at the whole system instead of individual parts, and you look at the relationships between them, because problems or challenges or successes belong to the whole system. And the problems actually exist between the parts, not just in one part. So it's easy to say, well, it's all so-and-so's fault. It's all Ted's fault. If he would just blah, 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 do this, that, or the other. However, really, when we look at this more carefully, what we're going to see is that problems exist in the relationships between the people and not just in one part of the system. The whole, then, the whole system can be understood if you can understand the interaction of the various parts. And understanding comes from looking up to larger and larger wholes, rather than looking at the individual parts of the system. And the other principle of systems thinking is that parts mutually influence one another. So a change that occurs in one part of the system will change things in others. And I've used this example sometimes. Imagine that you've got a couple, Lisa and Mary, and they've got 2 kids, and they're very active in the congregation. Lisa sings in the church choir. Mary has just volunteered to be the canvas leader for next year's building canvas. One of the teenagers is a volunteer in the nursery, and the younger child sings in the children's choir. One day, Mary gets a job offer, and they announce to everyone that they are leaving the congregation because they're going to have to move to California. Well, that change doesn't just happen in one piece of the system. It's going to affect multiple parts of the system. It's going to affect finances because of their pledge and because of the commitment they've made to be involved in the pledge drive. It's going to affect the choir. It's going to affect the other families that know them and so on. So parts mutually affect, influence, and affect one another in a system. Things that happen are co-causal. A change in one part of the system will cause changes in the other part. And that has to do with the illustration I just used. People become anxious during times of change or times of uncertainty. Here are just a few examples from some UU churches that I've had experience with. So in one congregation, the membership numbers decline. That makes people uncomfortable. They start to try to figure out reasons for it. They try perhaps to assess some blame. They're worried about the lower number of pledges. They're worried about the long-time survival of the congregation. Or, alternatively, membership numbers grow, causing stress because of the capacity of the system. We need more church school teachers. We need more resources in order to be able to meet the needs of these people. Our membership committee can't keep up with trying to involve all these new people in the church. Or here's another example. There's an argument over whether or not to use the word worship to describe what happens on Sunday morning. It makes people anxious to have an argument going on in the congregation where people are taking sides and getting angry with each other. Another time of change or uncertainty can be when a longtime minister announces his retirement or her retirement. People wonder, what will a church be like without Pastor so-and-so? He's been here ever since before I came, and so on. Another example, people use email to say mean things to each other, things that they would never say to each other in person. Can cause real anxiety in the congregation, and it can be really contagious. People are watching what's happening, they're listening to what's happening, and they don't like it, and they get anxious too. One last example from a UU congregation. Congregation decides to change its system of governance to give someone in the congregation more power. Maybe it's the minister, maybe it's the board over the committees. Whatever it is, this change upsets the power balance in the congregation. And in all these situations, anxiety resulted in these congregations. Now, Peter Steinke says anxiety is an automatic reaction to a threat. So either a real threat or an imagined threat. It makes people anxious. It can make us more alert, more self-conscious, and highly motivated to take action. It is contagious among people. And as anxiety increases, people become less thoughtful. They become resistant to what signals pain, and generally in kind of an edgy mood. Anxiety can cause distress, and chronic anxiety, if it's allowed to exist, can cause severe distress. There are congregations which are just in a chronic state of anxiety, so that any small change that comes along, the people really don't have any way of rolling with the punches. They don't have any way of handling distress, handling their issues as they come up, working on conflict at a low level. So everything gets to be a cause for huge anxiety. And of course, that's not healthy. Reactivity to anxiety can take a lot of different forms. Leadership might be in denial, and they just not want to face the fact that there is a problem in the congregation. Or perhaps it's the lay people who don't want to take responsibility for having an issue going on. So there's denial among the lay people. Some people may react to anxiety by oversimplifying. Well, if we could just, it was a very simple answer. If we could just go back to the way things used to be, we wouldn't have all these problems that we're experiencing. Other ways of reacting to anxiety could be by ignoring it or just acting disinterested. So it's kind of like denial, but it's sort of like it's not that no problem exists, as denial would be, but ignoring would be, if we just wait long enough and ignore this, it'll go away. In another congregation, the reaction to anxiety might be just kind of a freezing up or a paralysis in the congregation. The leaders become anxious. They're unable to think creatively. They're unable to get out of the situation they're in. They just get paralyzed. And then sometimes scapegoating, too, can be a reaction to anxiety. The leaders will need to challenge the congregation, as anxious as they might be, to use anxious times as a springboard for change and learning and a different way of functioning. So leaders, if they can separate themselves, kind of step out on the balcony, as Ronald Heifetz might say, to remove themselves from the fray long enough to be able to do some reflection and some thinking and some clear thinking, so that they can say, how can we use this anxiety? How can we use this time of turmoil as a springboard for some change, for some learning, and perhaps learn some different ways of functioning? So some behaviors that you might notice when people get anxious, one is called triangulation. You may be familiar with this one. It's so Ginny is mad at George, but instead of talking to George about what she's mad about, she talks to Betsy. So now Betsy is carrying the burden of trying to figure out what to do with the problem that really is between George and Ginny. And obviously, it gets Ginny off the hook a little bit. At least she's maybe not feeling so anxious anymore because she's told Betsy all about it. But it doesn't do very much to solve her problem with George. In fact, it doesn't do anything to solve that problem. Another behavior you might notice in terms of when there's anxiety is there's an emotional cutoff. People stop talking to the people that they're upset with. They just don't want to talk with them, and so they cut themselves off from those people. An opposite reaction is emotional fusion. And when people start to take sides in a conflict, sometimes they're so engaged with their own side that it's difficult or impossible to think that anyone else on the other side might have a valid point. So fusion means the people are so closely connected and so together on their point of view that they just refuse to see or are unable to see that people might have another valid point of view. And then possible result of anxiety can also be focusing on someone as a scapegoat rather than seeing that it's not just one person's fault, it's the problem in the system needs some work. Just saying, well, if we could just get rid of this minister, or if this board chair, wait till we end this board chair's term, and then everything is going to get better. So that's focusing on someone as a scapegoat. Peter Steinke lists 13 triggers of anxiety, and just make a mental note, how many of these have you seen in your congregation? If you've seen a lot, either you've had a lot of experience in working through anxiety, or else hopefully it's been a time when you could learn some things and perhaps do it with a little more help the next time through. So the first one is money. Now, this can be a little money, or it can be a lot of money. People say, well, I get it when you say having just a little bit of money or having a reducing amount of money is a trigger for anxiety for our congregation if our pledge drive didn't come in with the amount of money we need. But I don't see how having too much money would ever be an issue. Well, we have one congregation that I can think of. They were given, and this was back in the 1960s, they were given a gift by a family of, I think it was probably a bequest or something, $300,000. Well, that's a lot of money. Of course, it would be a lot of money now, but it was really a lot of money back in the 1960s. The problem was people started arguing over what they were going to do with the money, and so you can have just as many arguments about having too much money as you can about not having enough. The end of that situation was when, unfortunately, there was a fire in the sanctuary of that building, and they ended up having to use the money for fixing up the building after the fire. So, sexuality can be a trigger of anxiety. You can certainly see that especially on the news these days, in the Catholic Church, but we certainly have seen it in Unitarian Universalist churches too over the years. And issues of sexuality, or if a prominent couple in the church gets divorced, or if the minister is involved in or one of the staff members are involved in some sort of situation. Those kinds of things can unleash great anxiety in the congregation. Pastor's leadership style. Well, either the pastor could be too autocratic, trying to make all of his decisions himself or herself, or perhaps the pastor is kind of laissez-faire and really checks out the situation with a lot of people before moving forward on any particular path. That also can be a cause for anxiety. So pastor's leadership style is one of those triggers of anxiety, as well as the next one, the lay leadership style. Whether the lay leadership board chair or committee chair is hands-off or hands-on, whether they get the job done or whether they're content to kind of sit back, those kinds of things can make people anxious. Growth or survival. I mentioned the situation of a growing congregation stretching the capacity of the congregation, and also then the survival of a congregation. Whether if a congregation is in severe decline, they're not bringing in any new people, perhaps they're in a part of town or the demographic of the community isn't conducive, or for whatever reason, there are few people left and people are worried about whether or not this congregation is going to survive. Maybe it's a long-time congregation. Maybe it has building or property that people are worried about, that kind of thing. Boundaries are an issue. It could be things like embezzlement in a congregation, or people trying to take liberties or power where in areas where they really don't have the authority to do so. Those kinds of boundaries can cause anxiety. Trauma or transition, so something that happens at the church, a fire, as I mentioned earlier, or staff conflict is certainly one. If the staff is in conflict, people in the congregation find out about it, start taking sides, someone resigns, someone's fired, those kinds of things can trigger anxiety. Harm done to a child or the death of a child. We like to think we can protect our children. If there's a death of a child in the congregation, it raises people's anxiety because of the fear that raises for everyone. Old versus new. We saw a little bit of that in our congregation about the hymnal when we got the new gray hymnal. Some people said, we don't like this, we'd rather go back to the blue one. Or some people said, we hated the blue one, it was about time we got something new. So anything that's in the realm of old and new can be a cause for anxiety. Change in the time of the church service on Sunday mornings is one. Style of worship. In Protestant terms, they talk about contemporary or traditional worship, but I would point to in our congregations things like the style of worship and the elements of the worship. So, for example, what kind of music do we play? Do we have an organ? Do we use it? Do we have jazz quartet or something that plays? Is that okay, or is it all classical music? Disagreements over that kind of stuff can cause anxiety. Another example of that might be joys and concerns or joys and sorrows. If someone suggests changing the way that we do joys and concerns, some people might get upset about that kind of thing. The gap between the real and the ideal. This has to do with things like, for example, our values, a gap between how we live out our values in our congregations versus what our ideals are. It can be a gap between what we think we want or what we think we are and who we really are. It could have to do with mission and vision of the congregation, or where we are now and where we'd like to be. So, for example, it could have to do with us really needing to expand our building or meet the needs of our congregation, but we really don't have the resources to be able to do it. I'm working with a congregation now that's just built a wheelchair lift in their congregation. So for many years, they worried because they weren't accessible to people who used wheelchairs, and talked about it and worked through a process, I think really well, worked through a process about how to meet that gap between the real and the ideal. They wanted to be accessible, but it definitely took some work. It took some planning. It took some money to be able to move from what was their reality into what their ideal situation was to be able to welcome people. And so next weekend I'm going down to help them dedicate their wheelchair lift, which is a first for me and first for a lot of people, I think. We haven't done that before. And the last trigger for anxiety can be about buildings, construction, space, territory. It can be about who gets to use which room on what night. It can be about whether or not we have the space that we need, whether we own a building or whether we rent a building. All those kinds of things can be triggers of anxiety. Systems really don't have to be held hostage to reactivity to anxiety. Leaders can make a difference, and now we're going to move into the section about how leaders can be involved, what they can do to be able to help congregations work their way through these times of change, times of transition, times of turmoil. There's a bunch of suggestions right here on this slide. If congregational leaders can know, can recognize, and can help others understand that resistance is normal, that change is not easy for people, that even though we see the value in what's coming, if it's going to be a change for the better, there's still some loss and some grief associated with that. There may be a loss in terms of power. You know, I've always been the chair of the Building and Grounds Committee for 14 years, and now you're telling me we're going to change committee chair jobs every 2 years? What's that about? All my knowledge, all my wisdom is going to be lost. Why do we have to? So that kind of thing. Resistance is real. It's normal. And helping people understand changes, helping people move through them graciously, helping to acknowledge the things that those people have contributed at the same time as we let them know that things are going to, yes, we're going to change things. We think it'll be an opportunity for involving more people if we give more people the opportunity to be in leadership positions and so on. Those kinds of things can help make a difference in a situation like that. Leaders also need to know that their own calm functioning will help to influence the situation. So rather than getting upset, rather than reacting and shouting at people, obviously, but the capacity to be calm and reflective will help others to calm down and be reflective as well. Not always. Sometimes people are just going to take their marbles and go home. But in most cases, and without that kind of calm functioning, it's difficult to try to influence the situation in a positive direction. Leaders need to be patient. They need to exercise patience. They need to take their time. They need to know when it's time to move and when it's time to rest and wait for a little while or another opportunity. Leaders need to avoid giving in to the pressure of the moment. Sometimes you have to hold on and let the pressure build before you let the pressure be released. Sometimes you have to let people feel some discomfort in order to be able to move forward. Leaders can use anxious times as times for creative responses, and they can try their best to manage their own anxiety. That's not always easy, because when other people are getting anxious around us, it's easy for us to give into that anxiety too. So we need to find ways of handling our own anxiety and figuring out how do we do that? How do we maintain our own anxiety so that we're not adding to the distress in the system? There's an excellent book, and I think I put this at the end on the end slide too. It's a book called The Anxious Organization, Why Smart Companies Do Dumb Things, by a man named Jeffrey Miller. And it's not about churches, but it is about anxious and anxiety in organizations. And he's got some pretty good hints here for leaders. And so I'm going to be sharing some of these with you now from that book by Jeffrey Miller. Calm yourself by focusing on your breathing. Give less energy to the thoughts that have been churning in your brain as your pulse races and your stomach ties itself in knots. So just taking the time to calm down, to step back, to take a break. If the meeting is getting tense, take a 5-minute or 10-minute bio break. Announce it for the people so that everybody has a chance to step back, calm down, and come back to continue the discussion, perhaps in a more calm way. Another of his suggestions is collect yourself by making a map of the anxiety surrounding you and diagram the triangles in your map. So imagine that you've got a big piece of paper and you're trying to say, okay, who is mad at who in the congregation? Where are the clusters of anxiety? Who's talking to who? Who do you know is reporting that they've had conversations with these 3 people? And over here, what's going on over in this corner? Is there more anxiety over there about the same situation or something else? And then start diagramming those triangles it may help you to see the situation more clearly. And once you have this map that you've created, you can use it to talk it over with someone else who knows about the congregation, someone else who hopefully will be a reflective leader who can take a look at it, say, yes, I see what you're saying here. Oh, don't forget about this piece over here. And then try to figure out, are there some ways we can influence the system now that we've kind of taken the time to step back and look at how it's actually working? The author also talks about looking at pursuit and distancing, and that's that fusion and cutoff that I was talking about earlier. As people get angry with each other, there's a tendency, as I said, to distance themselves from one another. You'll find that people aren't talking with each other, or else there's a whole cluster of people who are talking with each other, but they're not talking to the people on the other side of the room. So that's another thing to look at on this anxiety map that you've created. Look at one upness and one downness. Where are the power bases in this illustration? Are there some matriarchs and patriarchs in the congregation who influence power behind the scenes, even though they're not currently on the board, for example? Are there people who ought to be listened to but are not being listened to because of something, because of the power, because of the lack of power that they have, because they're newer in the congregation rather than longer time? So that one downness, who are the people that we need to be listening to that we're not hearing from? Maybe it's the teenagers, or maybe it's the elders. I'm not, whatever, you'd have to look and analyze that for yourself. And then try to subtract the personalities, identify the underlying issue, and then take responsibility and say, how can we use this map, how can we use what we've learned in order to influence the system? How can we move forward in a better way? He goes on to say, act in a way that brings calm and clarity to the system that you're part of. Often when there's anxiety in the system, there might be rumors, there might be confusion, there might be people inflaming things by the use of email or talking only to the people that they want to talk with rather than the people that they're disagreeing with. How can you bring calm and clarity to that system? Are there some questions you can ask? Are there some people that you need to talk to? Are there some groups that you need to get together to have a conversation that aren't necessarily likely to want to be in conversation together? And are there ways that you could structure a conversation to help bring them together so that they can have a more reflective view of the situation? And last, he suggests to take an I position, to let others know what you believe, think, or intend. And that's the same as making I statements, so that you take responsibility for what you believe, what you think, what you do, and then let other people take responsibility for theirs. But by taking making an I statement or taking an I position, you're putting yourself there to say, this is what I think, and you are letting people know where you stand. And that can be very helpful when there's a lot of confusion in the system. The way Peter Steinke talks about this is, if the circumstance is crisis, leaders can bring calm. If the circumstance is confusion, they can bring focus. If the circumstance is stagnancy, leaders can bring challenge and introduce change into the system. If the circumstance is new situation, leaders can introduce change at a manageable pace. So let's look at that a little bit. If there's a crisis, leaders need to bring calm. When things feel like they're chaotic, it's very important for congregation leaders to remain calm and to bring calm to the system. You don't want to add to the chaos unless that's really your intention. But if it's very anxious, there's a lot of chaos. Really what you want to do is take responsibility for yourself. Be very thoughtful. Be decisive, even though you're feeling anxious. Be reflective. Don't do things too prematurely. Take the time to become calm, to think clearly and reflectively. Talk it over with someone else. Talk it over with another leader. Call the district or the region. Talk it over with someone on the district staff, regional staff, who can give you some coaching. that kind of thing can be helpful. Ask questions and seek information. One of the things that happens in system anxiety is people close down and they don't seek. They don't kind of maintain that research stance that Peter Steinke talks about. Maintain a research stance so that you're seeking out information. And by adding more information to the system, it could be that it'll help to calm the system. Resist pressure to find an immediate fix. People, when they're anxious, are feeling pain, and they will want a simple solution. So, as I said earlier in the webinar, if we just get rid of the minister, or once the board chair his term is over, we'll be whatever. But resist the pressure to use those immediate fixes, because that's not going to be the answer to the anxiety in the system. It may feel like it, and it may feel there'll be a sense of relief. But in the long term, complex situations are not solved by simplistic answers. It needs more work than that. During a crisis, a structure is needed, some kind of container to hold the parts together to assure that chaos does not reign. And that's really what the leadership function is to be. Leaders are to be people who can hold things together and assure that the life of the congregation goes on, that things still happen without giving in to the whole anxiety thing. When a congregation is in confusion, it's the job of leaders to bring focus. So perhaps it's a focus on mission. What are we here for? What is our mission? What are we to be doing here? What is it that we want to be? A focus on vision. What is it that we want to be in the future? If the congregation is confused about direction and doesn't have a vision for what it wants to be, you work together in a process to create a vision and perhaps a strategic plan. How will we get from here to where we want to be? Focus on values. What do we value? If we are arguing over priorities, if we are arguing over resources, if we are arguing over where we ought to be putting our energy, well, focus on our values. What kinds of things do we value? Is it social justice? And how will we use what we care about in the world to influence the world in a positive way? Focus on results. How will we know when we've succeeded? To take a strategic plan, and each year you look at where you've come from. You look at what the original plan was, you look at what you've done, and you look at what is to come in the next year. But focusing on results. Celebrate the successes and acknowledge the things that perhaps have changed. Maybe since you wrote that strategic plan, some circumstances have changed, and you've given up on parts of it because it's just no longer relevant, and then move on. And then focus on plan. How will we get to where we want to be? So in a time of confusion, it's up to the leaders to bring focus. If there's stagnancy in the system, if there's just not much going on, I mean, I don't know that we have that situation in our congregations all that often, but it can be in a part of the congregation or perhaps in the whole congregation. We've been doing the same thing year after year. We do it in the same way. We haven't had any great challenges. We haven't had any great successes. It's just kind of we're just maintaining. Then too much calm can lead to just stasis. So it's up to the leaders then to say, okay, here we are. We haven't had any social justice programming for several years, or social justice committee is kind of dead in the water. How will we show our values in the world? How will we work to change the world to make a better place? But introducing challenge then at a pace that people can handle. Because if you introduce too much change into the system, of course, that raises the anxiety level again. So introducing challenge at a pace that people can handle means that maybe not everybody's going to be able to handle it, but knowing the congregation well enough to know what kind of things you can change and when, knowing when the time is right, as it says here, so that you can move forward on things. And sometimes that has to do with explaining and being sure that everyone is coming along with you. You have your early adapters, and then you have the people in the middle, and then you have the people who may lag behind or may never get to the place where you are. But what you're trying to do is introduce change in a way that people can move along with you. And that may have to do with explaining the need for change, talking about the things that are bringing needed change about. Perhaps the resources are now available that weren't there to work on this before, whatever the context is that is helpful for them to know about. And then be sure and remember to state the values that are behind the ideas that you're championing so that people will understand what it is that you are doing and that you're not simply making change for change's sake, but rather you are working forward to bring about the values that we have in the world, the values that you have in your congregation. If your congregation values the principles from the 7 principles, the one about learning and continuous learning in our lives, but you haven't offered any educational experiences for adults for a few years, well, then talk about that value and talk about that value in terms of why it is that you're introducing the change, and we'll be having some Sunday morning adult discussion groups or something like that. Steinke says so that we are now living in a time of constant change. And when you think about how things change and how quickly things are changing, it's certainly true. Technology, I don't know if we can name an area that's not in change, but technology and the politics, the planet, the resources in the planet, the opportunities that we have now that we didn't used to have. We live in a time of constant change. Congregations may want peace and tranquility above all else. So some people might just say, I don't want things to stay the same. I don't want things to change. I just want things to be just the way they are. Sometimes that's not possible, and it's not possible in our congregations. Our congregations are changing too because the people in them are changing, and we need to change and adapt as well. So when the threat of pain emerges, there's an opportunity for real learning in that. But as Steinke says in the last point, leaders must be able to tolerate some degree of pain in themselves and also in other people. The things we've talked about in terms of the pace of introducing change and so on. Leaders need to be wise about that, but they also need to be able to say, even though this change that we're making may seem painful, may seem like we're losing some things here, we really think that the gain in the end will be worth the pain in the short term. If leaders give in to the weakest people among us, the weakest people in terms of who just refuse to make any changes or just can't handle the anxiety they're feeling and have to stop things, dead in the water, cold in the water, whatever, then the weakest people will control. And it's not a good situation when our leaders give in to people and refuse to make the changes or don't make the changes that they know would be needed because they're afraid of upsetting other people. Leaders have to be brave and just move forward and continue to keep people informed and continue to work with people and talk with people and bring people along. But in the end, if change is needed, then change really needs to occur. Search Institute has some keys to leading change in churches, and I put these in the PowerPoint as well because I thought it's in pretty brief form, but it would be helpful just in terms of keeping in mind for congregations, leaders trying to lead change. And some of the things I've already talked about, creating a shared vision so that you're bringing people along with you, which then, of course, leads to shared ownership. That's why you invite people into the process of creating a mission or creating a vision and a plan so that you have shared ownership, which will get you far in terms of accomplishing that. Clarifying needs and goals, gaining the support of key stakeholders, and being wise about who in your group it is that you need to go to. Some people just need to be informed. Some people need to give their consent. It's wise to know what situation it is for which people. and to take the time and take the energy, use the energy to be able to talk with people and help bring people along. Diffuse resistance, ways to do that are by asking questions, by having conversations with people. It's not by shutting yourself off or refusing to talk to the people who disagree. Being a good listener and being able to talk with people and reason with people and not argue with people, but allow people to come along at their pace and continue to stay in conversation with them and so on, will help diffuse their resistance. Stay connected to those who disagree. I've mentioned that a couple times already. Warm the atmosphere. Just warm, welcoming presence, hospitality, serving food at meetings, having the coffee pot going, those kinds of things can help bring about an atmosphere of warmth and one that will help people feel engaged and valued. When getting ready to make a change, plan and launch that carefully and be sure people are informed. Support the process even if and especially if it doesn't go the way you planned. So continue to work through the process. Continue to support the process, even if it doesn't turn out the way that you think. But in case if somebody else has another idea that turns out to be a better idea or that kind of thing, be generous in your support for the process. Leaders who focus on their own behavior, who maintain good boundaries, who articulate our values, who listen and reflect before responding, and who can do those things will influence this anxious system in a beneficial way. So maintain boundaries, focus on their own behavior, articulate our values, and listen and reflect before responding. Those go a long way in terms of influencing the anxious system. Here are the resources that I mentioned earlier. Congregational Leadership in Anxious Times is Peter Steinke's book. It's available in paperback from Amazon. The Anxious Congregation by Jeffrey Miller is an older book, and I'm not sure, you'd have to check Amazon or another resource for it. It was published by a group called Facts on Demand Press. And I don't even, at this point, I don't remember where I got it, but it is good in terms of really practical tips on how to maintain a good leadership style in an anxious organization or congregation in their case. The archived webinars are available at our main website at www.midamerica.uua.org. Participants tonight want to know who the Search Institute is. It's a Protestant group that studies churches. It's based in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And if you do a search on the Internet, you could probably find them. I know my colleague Phil Lund has taken a number of things that they've done. They, for a while, were doing, and maybe still are, doing some important work in youth leadership and working with ministry to youth. So thanks to all for participating tonight.